On behalf of myself and Rabbi Jason Rubenstein, I want to welcome everyone who's joined us tonight for tonight's Slifka online salon entitled The Politics of Community, Contemporary Tensions in Judaism and Catholicism, with New York Times op-ed columnist Douthat. In this moment of history, the concept of community is both more important and more complicated than ever before, and we're so fortunate to have Mr. Douthat here with us tonight. More on that in just a moment. Tonight's program is a partnership between the Slifka Center and St. Thomas More, the Catholic chapel and center at Yale. It's hard to imagine two organizations in the Yale orbit that are more similar in their function and relationship with Yale than these two. Both are 501c3 nonprofit organizations that are independent from Yale, but intricately connected into Yale's fabric of student life in every conceivable way. Both organizations operate significant physical facilities that serve a multitude of functions in support of the Yale community that go far beyond their specific religious groups. And both organizations support Yale students in ways that no academic or purely social organization could, thanks to their incredibly committed staff members, resources, and leadership. We are most grateful and blessed to have Father Ryan Lerner, Joseph Connolly, and their team as colleagues in this work every day, and especially in these difficult times. Tonight's program is emblematic of Slifka Center's approach to campus work in a number of ways. We see ourselves as part of a larger whole. Jewish students do not live in a vacuum. The campus community is strengthened by partnerships across cultural, religious, and political lines. We recognize that Jewish values that we hold so dear shine brightest when they are implemented in the real world. And we create as many opportunities as we can for students to bring these values, to advance their own growth as Jews, and to help them make the world a better place by helping others. In a time of rising hatred and bigotry in this country, including an alarming rise in anti-Semitism on college campuses and beyond, we also educate the broader community about what Jews, Jewish actions, and values can contribute to the peaceful future we all desire. We are so gratified when our campus partners like St. Thomas More see the value in working with us toward our common human destinations. This is an historic and unpleasant day in our country, where once again the divisions of our society were at the center of our public discourse. Our students are diverse in their views, and our country is as divided as ever. It is fitting then that we mark this occasion by digging into questions of what community really means, starting with ourselves and our immediate geographical and spiritual neighbors, who are, most importantly, our friends and colleagues in a common cause. We thank you, Mr. Douthat, for being here with us tonight for this important discussion. And on behalf of the Slifka Center and St. Thomas More, I thank all of you for joining us this evening. On to tonight's program. As usual, Rabbi Jason Rubenstein will introduce tonight's speaker and other presenters for the program. He will also take questions and comments in the chat, which can be found along the bottom of your Zoom screen. We want to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be available on our website along with recordings of our previous Slifka Center salons. We also hope you'll take a moment to fill out the brief survey at the end. We're excited to share these salons with all of you in keeping with Slifka Center's goals, to explore the intersection of what is Jewish, American, and Yale in our constantly changing world. It is now my pleasure to turn over the program to my friend, teacher, and colleague, Rabbi Jason Rubenstein.
Thank you, Uri, for gathering us here. And I want to thank everyone who's here tonight when we're so kind of attracted by the gravity of our news feeds and refreshing the New York Times homepage to take some time away to actually connect to people and hear voices, and later in the program to share your questions and opinions in the chat. And I especially want to welcome, in addition to our guest, Ross Douthat, who I'll introduce in just a second, Carlene Demiani, who's just a treasured member of the religious community here at Yale. Carlene is a native of Southern California, a UCLA alumna and an alumna of Yale Divinity School, and an assistant chaplain at St. Thomas More, and has been just a gracious veteran member of this community, as so many of us at Slifka have been new, and we're excited to partner. We put on an amazing program that you created last year about Jerusalem together. And this is just the second of what I hope will be a multi-chapter evening. And together we're going to be, Carlene and I will be in conversation with Mr. Douthat, who almost certainly needs no introduction, is a prolific, widely commented on columnist for the New York Times, author of numerous books on religion, contemporary politics, Catholicism, the Republican Party, and a neighbor here and a lecturer at Yale Law School as well. Mr. Douthat, we're really excited to have you here. And I said this to you, and I'll say it to everyone. One of the particular reasons that you came to mind for our community as someone who wanted to be in dialogue with, really, is that your writings on the Jewish community have an kind of an uncanny accuracy. They kind of assess us in ways that feel accurate and really insightful, and wanted to really develop that intuition, which so many of us have read about on the pages of the New York Times, into a dialogue tonight. So we are also going to talk a little bit about the events of the last week, from the insurrection to today's impeachment vote. But we're gonna take a little bit of time to get there, because I think once we start discussing politics, it'll be hard to escape the strong gravitational pull of that black hole. So first, we're going to talk about really placing the contemporary Jewish and Catholic communities in dialogue with each other. What parallels do we observe? What anti-parallels do we observe? And so to kick that off, I'm going to kind of pose a very long form question to you, or a observation and then a question, Ross. So the observations, I'll just kind of name a few of what, sitting in the seat of someone in the organized Jewish community, we see as the major trends that are shaping us, that obviously have been in motion for some time and affect really every aspect of what we do, not just the organizational, but also the personal and theological. So there's three in one bucket and then a kind of a counterweight. And then I want to hear how all of this looks from your vantage point as a participant in and observer of the American Catholic community, what lines of flight you see. So the three trends I'll draw out on the one side that I think are pretty uncontroversial as some of the major storylines in American Judaism. The first is simply a diminution of our numbers, not so much in terms of how many Jews are there, but in terms of weekly participation rates, in terms of donation rates. There's a helpful statistic, the Jewish GDP, which is created by Eddie Pinker here at the School of Management, which just attempts to measure the aggregated budgets of all the Jewish organizations in America. And it's declining, not very rapidly, but declining. So I think that's the first one, is there's an anxiety about the kind of viability in a free, open society where identity is shifting and less assumed intergenerationally about Judaism's ability to survive and thrive on a kind of financial and institutional scale. The second is increasing divisions within the Jewish community, which certainly have a political dimension, but are also very much in people's ritual observance, manner of dress, Jewish day schools versus public schools, etc. Just the splits between a larger and larger kind of enclave of centrist or right-wing orthodoxy versus increasingly, you might call it assimilated or acculturated kind of what maybe perhaps mainstream of roughly 80% of American Jews, and just the gap, the sense that maybe a generation or two ago there was a center of American Jews, and that center is not holding, as are so many other centers. Really is a religious community. And then the third is the new chapters that are being written in the relationship between the American Jewish community and Israel. Right, a kind of alliance and relationship which used to be natural, which used to be a given, which used to even be dogmatic, I would say, for a certain period of time. That was if not the defining loyalty and program of American Jewish individuals and communities has become increasingly contested. The kind of rise on the left of certain groups, the tensions that have been basically placed between American Jewish electorate, which is largely kind of supermajority Democrat, and then a Netanyahu-Trump alliance is the current chapter, but there's obviously many others. And thinking about what this means for the kind of project of world Jewry and the kind of benefits that the flourishing of Israel and a close relationship between Israel and America have given to the American Jewish community, and what the future of that looks like. So those are three kind of major sources of strain and concern. And I also want to say at the same time, this is the counterweight, there's some amazing pockets of creativity. You might think of the music of someone like a Joey Weisenberg, or as a Deborah Sachs-Mintz, some of the writing and scholarship that's coming out of the American Jewish community, experimental synagogues, et cetera, are sources of pride and delight, and the kinds of things that you can imagine when the history is written of 21st century American Judaism will have prominent places. And that's also an important part of the story, I think, to just tell one of gloom and doom would be not just uninspiring and deflating, but also inaccurate. And so I wanted to kind of hear against that backdrop how you see the major storylines, trends, forces within the Catholic community today, and especially any parallels or anti-parallels you want to draw to the picture I just gave of America's Jewish community.
Sure. That's quite an introduction, and I'll have a hard time matching the breadth and concision combined of how you just covered the state of American Judaism. But first, I just want to thank you and the Slifka Center and Thomas More and everyone who's joined tonight. And I'm particularly grateful for those kind words about my very occasional writings about Judaism. I, as a writer for the New York Times, which, as most people know, has a fairly large and vocal and contentious Jewish readership, as well as some Jewish writers for our paper, I believe, here and there. I try to pick my spots very carefully. And if I seem insightful in any way, it's probably because I am so cautious and make sure to only write about the Jews when I feel like I actually really know what I'm talking about. Whereas, you know, writing about American politics, I have to do it every week, whether I know what I'm talking about or not. So there's a slight selection effect that maybe makes me seem more insightful than I really am. But just, so I will attempt then to mirror your structure. I'll attempt a sort of similar structural look at American Catholicism that will, I think, cover some of the real similarities and also some of, sorry, I have an itch on my nose, some of the, you know, very interesting distinctions and differences between the positions of the two communities. So I'll follow your schematic and start with the question of sort of institutional decline, where I think American Catholicism is in a somewhat different position from American Judaism because it has passed through this period of this sort of interesting period of internal decline joined to immigration from outside, right? So if you just took the American Catholicism that existed circa 1968 and traced the story forward in terms of mass attendance, donations, sort of various measures of institutional strength, you would see a pretty stark story of decline, one as stark by certain measurements as the story of mainline Protestant decline over the same period. However, America has also taken in a very large number of immigrants from mostly Catholic countries over that same period, which has in certain ways compensated for some of that white Catholic or earlier waves of ethnic Catholic, however you want to phrase it, institutional decline. And it's meant that, you know, for instance, the decline in mass attendance is real, but not nearly as steep as it would be without immigration. And it also means that there's real geographic variation in the shifts in American Catholicism. So Catholicism in the Northeast and the Rust Belt really looks a lot like the story you just suggested or sketched at in Judaism, where you have parish closures, you have, you know, steep declines from where things stood 40 or 50 years ago. But then American Catholicism in the South, and especially the Southwest, has been through a long period of growth where they're, you know, building new cathedrals and new parishes, and, you know, there's real expansion. So it's a sort of very geographically variable story depending on particularly immigration trends. And then finally, of course, in Catholicism, you have the complicating factor of the sex abuse crisis, which has, you know, caused a certain acceleration of institutional decline, especially in dioceses and archdioceses that have been particularly hard hit or have had to make particularly large payouts, that's sort of distinct from larger demographic trends, but also obviously bound up in them as well. And I think looking forward, my sense of things is that Catholicism right now is at a kind of generational tipping point as the baby boom generation ages and passes away, where the questions that you're describing, the institutional questions, are going to become more substantial, and they're going to be more dramatic challenges for the institutional church over the next generation. To people who do fundraising, for instance, for Catholic schools in New York City, they will say, well, we have this generation of people who are sort of rich people who are loosely attached to the church, but still give us a lot of money. And the next generation of rich people doesn't have nearly as many loosely attached Catholics who still give money to Catholic schools. And that sort of secularization trend is probably going to affect how a lot of dioceses fundraise and how Catholic schools are supported, and create a lot of new challenges for the church over the next 30 years, challenges of consolidation and shrinkage of the kind, that you already see happening in this state, right, where we just passed through a very painful period of sort of parish consolidation that wasn't nearly as painful as what's likely on the horizon in 10 or 15 years. So that's the first point. The point about divisions, American Catholicism has been living with a pretty clear liberal, conservative, progressive, traditionalist, whatever terms you want to use, division. I mean, it goes back earlier than the Second Vatican Council, but it's been extremely pronounced ever since the Second Vatican Council. And this sort of scale of the polarization has ebbed and flowed in different periods. I think it's fair to say that we've passed through a period of pretty sharp polarization, and there are obvious parallels, I think, to trends playing out in between Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, right? There are some sort of differential birth rates where more traditionalist Catholics tend to have more kids. There was for a while a sort of conservative Catholic triumphalism about how, we're having all the kids and our orders have all the vocations, and so we'll own the future, right? That has some mirroring in parts of Orthodox Judaism, I think. That was also a bit of an oversimplification, and I think the last 10 years have been kind of hard on that conservative triumphalism. But definitely there are some real parallels there, with the obvious distinction that American Catholics all belong to the same hierarchical church in a way that Reform and Orthodox Jews do not, which brings me to the third point, right, where this is not at all an exact parallel, but there are some points of symmetry in the complex relationship that American Catholics have to the papacy and to Rome, right? Where, fairly predictably, when you were in a period where the papacy was seen as sort of a conservative, a sort of conservative bulwark institution, conservative American Catholics were, sort of ultramontane, and as we say, and, very pro-pope. And in a what seems like a more liberal or reforming pontificate, the balance has shifted, and conservative Catholics, myself sometimes included, have been more critical of the papacy. But then that also interfaces with a kind of geopolitical element, right, where the US is sort of in a position relative to Rome like France was relative to the Vatican in the 17th and 18th century, right, where it's this really powerful country that has a very important Catholic church that has a lot of influence on the global church, but is also always in some kind of conflict with Rome, is regarded with very suspicion in the Vatican. And again, that's taken different forms, a more conservative suspicion of the liberal side of the American church 20 years ago. And now I think it's fair to say some real suspicion in the Vatican of the dynamics in the Trump era of American Catholicism. And I've said the word Trump, which we promised not to do for a while. But then, so that's not quite the same as the relationship to Israel, but there is sort of a similar sense where there's sort of there's the U.S. church, and then there's sort of this central place outside the U.S. that occupies an incredibly important role in the American Catholic imagination, with the further factor that there are also another billion or so Catholics who are neither in the Vatican nor in the United States, which doesn't really have a parallel, I think, in the American Jewish-Israeli relationship. So, and then to end on sort of a point of optimism, and I will say that generally I'm kind of pessimistic about the next 25 years of American Catholic history, as I am about the next 25 years of American history. But I definitely find that when I talk on college campuses, or back when I traveled to college campuses before the current period, there is, there is a lot of striking dynamism among younger Catholics, and there are a number of urban parishes, especially with both young Catholics and sort of young parent, young family Catholics, that are in certain ways more dynamic than was the norm 20 years ago. My impression is that both the Yale and the Harvard Catholic communities are more dynamic and interesting places in many ways than they were when I was growing up in New Haven and then attending school at that other college up the way. So that has to be, I think, taken as a point of optimism, even if it also does reflect a deep trend in American religion writ large, which is sort of the ebbing of institutional religion in working class communities, and strangely, its greater resilience among the college educated, which is not, I think, the cliche of how secularization works, but has actually been the pattern of the last 20 or 30 years. So that's enough rambling. Back to you.
Fascinating. And I mean, I know you ended on a kind of an optimism that you regard and kind of notice at college campuses, especially here at Yale. Couldn't be a better segue. So Carlene, share with us what Catholic life is like today at Yale. I mean, obviously COVID makes things complicated to tell what's the data and what's the noise, but tell us what the community is like, what students care about, are interested in, and are creating.
Sure. No, well, thank you so much for having me. And it's always such a delight and privilege to team up with you all at Slifka. We have such admiration and respect for everything you do on Yale's campus. So thank you for having us. And I will say that I get to work with such amazing Catholic students at Yale. And at St. Thomas More, we see a lot of vibrancy. It really is kind of one of those pockets of creativity that you mentioned, Rabbi Jason, at the beginning. And so it's a delight to see students deeply engaged in their faith and passionate about their faith and enthusiastic about their faith. I do see there is, as we're talking about kind of some tensions among our students, I work primarily with undergraduates, and New Haven is such an interesting place to be Catholic because you have two very different brands of Catholicism in New Haven that are both, quite vibrant, especially right now. You have St. Mary's, which is the historic parish in New Haven, where the Knights of Columbus were founded, and the priest who founded them was just beatified, Father Michael J. McGivney, so he's on the way to become a saint. And then you have St. Thomas More, the Catholic chapel at Yale, which is also a very vibrant and exciting place. Some students will sort of caricature these two places, and you'll hear words like, St. Mary's being described as traditional, a little bit more conservative, more devotional. St. Thomas More is kind of known as more progressive, liberal. Sometimes we're known for kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit. And so it's interesting, kind of in the city of New Haven, you have this sort of, as Ross was alluding to, this division in American Catholicism. So you just kind of see in New Haven these two very different brands of Catholicism on display. And Ross, you mentioned briefly the sex abuse crisis, and that is a hot topic among our students, as it is in the Catholic Church, particularly with recently, and now ex-Cardinal McCarrick report coming out. And it's interesting because I'll hear students kind of discussing it and asking about, what caused the sex abuse crisis, or what's responsible for it. And oftentimes you kind of have this caricature in Catholicism where, the more conservative Catholics will posit the blame on homosexuality, and the more progressive Catholics will say, well, actually it's clericalism, right? This idea of giving excessive deference, or this assumption of moral superiority, or it's celibacy. So it's really interesting, particularly among our students, to hear them debating about this and kind of hashing this out, and hearing those different divides and tensions as well. But I do just want to highlight that one of the best events I did, one of the most amazing events that we did, was a partnership between St. Thomas More and St. Mary's, where we all our students teamed up and we packaged about 10,000 meals for Catholic Relief Services, and we sent them to individuals who are facing food insecurity in Latin America. So kind of just an example of coming together to have a positive impact on our global community, or that community in Latin America. And I guess Ross, I just wanted to ask you, we've talked a bit about, tensions and divides, but I'm curious if you might highlight any examples you see of American Catholics kind of bridging this sort of liberal, conservative, or however you want to call it, divide, and coming together to enact positive social change.
Sure. I mean, again, I feel like I do feel like generally super positive social change has been kind of thin on the ground for a little while. I would frame it this way, right? I think that many parishes in the United States contain within themselves multitudes, right? And that what you described, the collaboration between parishioners at Thomas More and parishioners at St. Mary's, is, I think, characteristic of something that happens within lots and lots of Catholic parishes, right? Where you'll have a parish that will have it will have a higher mass, and it will have the 5 p.m. schleppy mass that God knows I've gone to at occasion, right? It will have sort of the kind of social justice Catholicism and the rosaries for the unborn Catholicism, and all of those things will actually coexist, not just in sort of neighboring parishes, but under the same parish roof. And in many ways, that is that's sort of the best of American Catholicism in certain ways, is that for all of the fissures and debates and crises since the Second Vatican Council, the Church has actually not broken, right? And we have lots of, cautionary examples in the world of Protestantism of how post-60s theological and moral debates have led to, literal schisms, or sort of, just sort of fracturing, fracturing within denominations. And those fractures all exist in Catholicism, but there is a sort of impressive kind of unity that sustains itself, sort of a kind of for the time being Catholicism, I think was a phrase I used once. There's a when I think I used it when I was in the midst of some particularly heated argument with a bunch of theologians, and I sort of tried to step back. And I think the example I used was there's a shrine in Litchfield, Connecticut, called Our Lady of Lourdes, that I highly recommend Jews as well as Catholics, but maybe particularly Catholics, if you're driving in that part of the state, to pay a visit. And we used to go there when I was a kid, and then when we moved back to Connecticut, we'll go up there when it's nice. They have an outdoor mass, and it's a place where the priest, the order that runs it, the vibe you get from the priests is a sort of, 1970s kind of, peace and justice Catholicism vibe, a very Pope Francis vibe in certain ways, right? But then the vibe from a lot of the parishioners or the people who show up, right? It's a place of pilgrimage. It's a place for people who are really ill to go and pray, can seem more, not like traditionalist, but more sort of conservative in sort of its devotional style. And both those things are sort of there at once. And it's not a real parish. It's sort of the crowd there changes every Sunday. But I've always thought of that as sort of a striking example of how these sort of pieces that, especially in my profession, are often sort of at war with each other, can actually sort of fit together into something that looks a little bit more like an actually universal church. So was that sufficiently optimistic as a sketch?
Wow, I love the kind of the pictures and the questions you would never kind of even think to ask from a Jewish perspective here in this dialogue. And I do want to share one thing that I learned. One of my chief learnings in preparing this was I just assumed, I lived in New York for 12 years, reading articles about X building being sold off by the archdiocese, which felt similar to synagogue closures or mergers, that it was obvious that American Catholics are kind of preoccupied by and anxious about these kinds of questions of numbers and dollars in the same way we Jews are. And I learned very quickly in conversation with Carlene, it's not the case. It's not as kind of the weight of what Simon Rabinowitz called the ever dying people. right? This kind of anxiety of the Jews of always being on the precipice, the ones who will let the whole tradition down for all of posterity and all of the future, just isn't kind of shared. And it seems so obvious to me that it would be, and perhaps it's that 1 billion number has something to do with it.
I think the billion has a lot to do with it. I mean, I think there's a sense of, there's the famous promise that, the alleged Messiah Jesus of Nazareth offered, right? About the gates of hell not prevailing against the church. The idea is that the gates of hell won't prevail against the church. They might prevail for a while against the church in New Jersey, right? Like that could happen, but that's okay. It's not ideal, but you sort of, there's less of a sense of, I don't know. I mean, and it may feed a certain complacency, but and that is something I do think that shows up sometimes too in Catholic debates. This sort of sense of like the antiquity and continuity of the church means that no crisis can actually be that bad. And sometimes I think we could use more of a sense that no, actually some of these crises are really that bad. And again, I think there may be. I do think if we're having this conversation in 2035 or 2025, which is really soon, there might be more sort of urgency about institutional decline from American Catholics.
Interesting. Well, we'll see. We'll come back in 4 years.
It's terrifying that 2025 is now like the near future.
Yeah.
But anyway.
The next inauguration just around the corner. Gotta pray to get through this one. People are sending in questions in the chat, which is great. That is the proper use of the chat. Also observations, shout outs, etc. It's great to see that. After I'm going to pose one more question to Ross, and then I'm actually going to start taking questions from the chat. So this is a great time to submit them if you want to be featured and ask your question in the second half of the program. Okay, there was an impeachment today. For those of you who have been, somehow separated from your screens all day, I'll break the news to you. Spoiler. And I wanted this, but the impeachment is not really the story. I think it's kind of the religious politics of the last 4 years. And so I wanted, Rusty, to hear you kind of reflect on it. From a Jewish perspective, the story is. I'm gonna simplify, and I shouldn't say a Jewish perspective. I'll say my perspective, which I think is generally reflective of the students and the Jewish community here. It feels like a pretty straight path from fine people on both sides at Charlottesville. The Jews will not chanting, some of those fine people chanting, the Jews will not replace us, right? I forget who it was. Someone said, well, that the moment there was when President Trump broke the anti-Semitic consensus in American politics, that there used to be this kind of strong bulwark that even there was a litmus test of any interaction with anti-Semitism was disqualifying, and that was kind of what the dam was broke, to the picture that went viral this past week of the Camp Auschwitz shirt in the Capitol rotunda, and then in between we have the Tree of Life massacre, and then the similar manifestos that are showing up in Christchurch and elsewhere. And so it's a new kind of moment and a worse moment. And I'll just share the extent this is helpful. I remember, this is not so many years ago. This is probably 2007. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, one of the, in some ways, the kind of the greatest living American Jewish theologian. He's now in his 80s, I believe. Was asked, he said he was asked by a young person, how do I understand my grandmother being so on the lookout for anti-Semitism? He said, you have to understand, if someone was served hot soup for the first 60 years of their life, they'd blow on every bowl of soup they were given for the last 30, right? That is just so ingrained in the Jewish awareness. But the sense was here in America that it's not so much maladaptive, but it's not adaptive. It's not representative of where we are. And just thinking of how, and I found that very kind of moving. It helped me kind of gain an intergenerational empathy, and how 13, 14 years later, that comment has aged so poorly, right? That actually the soup has gotten quite hot all of a sudden in ways, where I mentioned the rise in anti-Semitism and the kind of the condoning of it, having gotten into QAnon, et cetera. And so there is a kind of a newly fraught politics of a Jewishness in America, not just in the American Jewish community, but in the kind of the role of anti-Semitism in a way that I think no one of my generation ever imagined we would be living in. And to be quite honest, I'm not quite sure what to do with, because there was a very comfortable kind of neutrality AIPAC has been the best example. We work with both parties in a kind of equation, and that feels hard. There are other moments on the left, certain things that feel, the kind of anti-Semitism is also resonant there. I don't want to make equations, but there is a certain, again, the center not holding, that we are really, I would say, struggling to wrap our heads around, come together. And perhaps the single clearest example of this was on, I believe it was Sunday, when the ADL called for the president's removal, something that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. And the headline in the forward was, uncharted territory for the American Jewish community. So if you would kind of speak to, that issue, Israel intersects, and then also there's a Catholic piece to politics and the contemporary politics of America. How does this all look from where you sit?
It's extremely and often insanely complicated in ways that are, I think, very, very hard to distill and simplify, right? Because let's start with the Trump administration, right? Or start with the Trump phenomenon. So Trump himself, and without sort of reading his heart or anything like that, let's just say that Donald Trump doesn't like to speak ill of anyone who likes him. And a lot of racists and anti-Semites decided that they liked Donald Trump early on, and Trump made certain choices, obviously birtherism above all, that were sort of pitched to exactly that constituency. And in that sense, the Trump era has been empowering for a certain kind of heretofore marginal bigotry, as no recent presidency has been before. At the same time, the Trump administration has, a stronger alliance with the government of the State of Israel than, even Republican presidencies included, any modern American presidency. And there's sort of which again, speaks to the point you were making earlier about sort of the difference between, the position of American Jews and the position of Israeli Jews, and sort of the growing gulf in perceptions between those communities. But it's really true that if you live in the State of Israel, the Trump era seems to have been good for the Jews. Now, said it bracketing questions of, is it good for the Jews in the long run to have, the occupation in the West Bank and so on, just in terms of like the geopolitical position of Israel relative to its neighbors, including the recent normalizations of relationships brokered in part by the Trump administration, right? So both of those things are happening at the same time, and fitting them together into a single narrative is really hard to do. At the same time, right, you have a dynamic on the American left where, the shifting perspectives on the left, the rise of what gets referred to as, wokeness and sort of social justice ideology and so on, in a lot of those narratives, the Jews and Judaism occupy a position that's very different from the position that your grandmother would have perceived Jews and Judaism as occupying, right? That there are narratives on the left now that portray and depict and assume that American Jews are a privileged ethnic group who partake of white privilege, if not Jewish privilege. Then the State of Israel is perceived as sort of a nationalist regime, not a sort of beleaguered bunker for a persecuted people. And this means that, even where there isn't anti-Semitism on the left, there isn't the same kind of sort of philo-Semitism where, put it this way, I went to high school at Hampden Hall, right, in New Haven, just up the road at Whitney Avenue. And, it was a very liberal private school. And we had, what you would call sort of a social justice curriculum. And in that curriculum, American slavery and the Holocaust were sort of the central parts of the curriculum, right? And they were sort of parallel narratives that were sort of formative narratives of oppression and sort of, horrors that were sort of central to that narrative. And I don't think the social justice narratives of 2020 have that kind of dynamic. It's more of sort of a tapestry of historical wrongs and, you know, reflecting the greater diversity of the American left, the greater diversity of the US, but that sort of particular position that the Holocaust played in kind of the liturgies of the left, you might almost say, I think has changed substantially over the last generation, and thereby changed American Jews' relationship to left-wing politics, even if it hasn't yet, you know, changed the basic fact that most American Jews vote for Democratic politicians. So anyway, I don't want to go on too long. I think you can imagine, though, a lot of different futures out of this, right? You could imagine a future where, you know, the American Republican Party finds a way to sort of purge itself of the kind of, you know, the Charlottesville and the stuff on the Washington Mall anti-Semitism that got sort of summoned up. And you, in the long run, end up having a kind of actual swing in American Jewish politics where a lot of more American Jews end up voting for the more conservative party, as they do, for instance, in the United Kingdom, right? But you could also imagine a world, and I'll bring up QAnon here, right, where the American right sort of goes deeper into anti-globalist conspiracy theories that are basically at times like anti-Semitism without the Jews, right? It's like, you know, instead of Jews, it's the globalists, right? It's this, you know, it's sort of, but so it partakes of
George Soros often.
Right. Well, no, it's not. Sometimes, right. Sometimes it's just anti-Semitism or it's anti-globalism with Jewish villains. But like QAnon is sort of a blood libel, right? But it's just sort of, it's more omnidirected at any globalist elite is, you know, sort of drawing out the blood of children. And anyway, obviously, to the extent that the American right becomes QAnonified, American Jews are not going to find a happy home there. So I think it's just very much the situation is just very much in flux. I will say, to try and be optimistic again in this pessimistic moment, I don't think fundamentally the position of Jews in the US has changed as much in the last 10 years as, you know, certain parts of the internet and, you know, the horrifying events in Pittsburgh and elsewhere would suggest. I do think the American Jewish position in the US is more secure than it has sometimes felt. But, you know, we shall see.
Wow, this is great. I mean, the chat is a wonder to behold. It's a great document. We're not going to get to all of it. There's two questions that I picked out so far. The first is from Scott Greenberg. He's a recent alum who was the editor of Shibboleth, the undergraduate journal of Jewish thought in his time. And I want to just give a little bit of backdrop to the question, then turn it over to you, Scott. It's about basically as kind of Christians become a minority in America, maybe there are some things to learn from the Jewish experience. And one avenue I want to draw people towards is a kind of fascinating conversation that unfolded over the summer about the philosophy of integralism, which is a kind of a legal philosophy. Ross, that's a rueful smile. There was a professor at a different Harvard Law School up the way,
Yes.
Adrian Vermeule, who published an article basically arguing for something very different than a kind of a liberal state, that Vermeule's an adult convert to Catholicism, that they're kind of a positive view of the good, that the government would direct its citizens to maybe do something, not just kind of encourage them to find their own ways. Bill Barr has been kind of associated with this view in different ways, and it's been a kind of interesting as a Jew, to view this position, which seems to have some traction in the American Catholic legal community on the right, that there should be a good fit between American law and Catholicism. Whereas the Jews, I think there is a certain kind of Jewish social justice train that's, you know, we believe in a certain picture of social justice, America should reflect that, but there's also a kind of a diasporic sense that, well, this is not a country where we expect to be setting the template for how things go. So Scott, we're going to turn things over to you, and I would love to hear exactly how you formulate this question for Carlene and Ross.
Hi. So my question is this, which is that the Jewish community has, for its time in America, always been a minority. and that as America is becoming further and further away from a majority Christian nation, if there are any lessons that Christians can or should take from the experience of the Jews, how we've dealt with our status as a religious minority here.
I mean, Carlene, I don't want to prevent you from jumping in if you, okay. So I think so here's what I see as the challenge for American Christians, right? It's that there is this sort of, it's almost sort of a sour spot that you can occupy as a religious tradition, where you are sort of large enough to be simultaneously extremely politically influential and also threatening to people who disagree with you, but not large enough to actually sort of set the tone for culture and society as a whole. And that's sort of the position that in its decline, I think America's Christian churches have ended up in, right? Where there's sort of this sense that simultaneously, like, you know, American Christianity is large enough and vital enough that the idea of sort of just seeing yourself as a kind of creative minority in a secular or post-Christian society seems like sort of preemptive surrender, right? It's like sort of we're giving up. And especially, I mean, the other issue here, right, is that Christianity is a much more evangelistic religion than Judaism, right? So there is much more of a sense that there's some kind of Christian obligation, not necessarily to set up the integralist empire of Guadalupe in in the Americas, but at the very least to sort of always be converting, right? So that alone makes it hard to sort of accept yourself as just a minority within this larger society. But then again, it's like, you know, put it this way, right? Like to secular liberals, I would say the evangelical baker who doesn't want to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding is seen as a much more threatening and problematic figure than an Orthodox Jew who has some sort of, you know, business arrangement that creates similar issues, right, of sort of, you know, competing rights and so on. And I think that's because and it's not, you know, it's not true in every circumstance. And obviously Europe, which is a sort of a separate case study, has all kinds of issues and debates around kosher and halal rules. But I think in the American context, there's sort of this sense that the evangelical baker, because evangelicalism is this big, active cultural and political force, has to be sort of restrained and sort of taught a lesson in certain ways. And then the evangelical Christian themselves may feel and do feel that like they have an obligation to, you know, figure out how to crush and defeat the secular liberal. And I don't think there's the same dynamic with Jewish communities because they aren't, you know, I mean, like American Catholicism is huge, even in period of decline and division. It's the largest religion in the US. Its infrastructure is everywhere. You know, there are going to be debates about Catholic hospitals for the next 20 years. Like, because in many communities, the Catholic hospital is the only hospital, or it's the main hospital. So I guess there are unquestionably lessons that serious Christians in a secular society should be able to learn from the Jewish experience. But we're in this position where it's hard to figure out exactly how to learn them, because Christianity has this weird combination of decline and yet sort of consistent influence and resilience. So I didn't really answer your question. I sort of described why it's a hard question to answer.
Carlene, you passed the baton to Ross, and now it's getting passed back to you. I'll see if we can unmute you there.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fabulous question, and you know, I thought Ross brought up a number of great points, and and knowing that we are a little bit short on time, Jason, you actually asked me if I'd be willing to talk about a couple of the other questions in the chat. So I might just, if it's okay, sort of mention just I love the question about talking about, are there other theological tensions between liberal and conservative Catholics? Since I did mention the sex abuse crisis. So Rabbi Jason, would you like the person to read the question, or should I just dive right in?
I'd say dive right in just to highlight what Carlene was saying. I think, a lot of the Jewish people are like, tell us more about the theological differences in the church. It's totally fascinating. And, the theology is so much more central in Catholic history and present than it is in Judaism. So if you could give us a window into where those fissures are, that would be really fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the role of women is, one of the main questions right now that's talked about. Just in my own role as a laywoman, working in a position, of authority at St. Thomas More, sometimes there's confusion about like, wait, who are you? Like you're a woman, you're a chaplain. Like, is that possible? And so I would say this question of, the role of women in the church right now, the Catholic Church has an all-male celebrate priesthood. And so, the American church, I think there's this idea, like there's support about the possibility of ordaining women, but whereas in the global church, not so much. So we have, again, this tension of the American church and the global church. So the role of women is a really big one. Also, Pope Francis's encyclicals have created a little bit of a stir among the faithful, particularly Amoris Laetitia, where he talks about this question. So in Catholicism, if you're a divorced, remarried Catholic, you cannot receive the Eucharist during Mass. And that is definitely an area of contention. So in his encyclical, he addresses that. And a lot of the American bishops some of the American bishops, I should say, thought he was a bit too gray. And so there was, controversy about that. So that's also another hot topic right now. Divorced, remarried Catholics, can they receive the Eucharist? And also, I think a real interesting point is you have this huge diversity among Catholics of like, what's the most important thing we should be focusing on? Pope Francis in Laudato Si talks a lot about climate change. But then you have some Catholics, I just heard a Catholic the other day saying like, why are we talking about climate change? We should be talking about, abortion and more like, pro-life issues. And so like why are we talking about that? So it's kind of like what should we be focusing on right now? So that's kind of like, and these like the issue of climate change is a hot topic anywhere, but especially right now in the Catholic Church. And so Pope Francis, like you have and feel free, Ross, to disagree, but you sort of have the German bishops who can be a little bit more progressive, which he seems to really kind of laud and support, and then the American bishops can be a little bit more rigid, and so so Pope Francis, I think, can sometimes have some harsh words for the USCCB, like the US bishops. So it is interesting with our current Pope to see some of these fissures and tensions that arise.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are fundamental similarities between the Catholic and Jewish experience here, in the sense that the social revolutions of the 1960s raised a set of questions about, sex, marriage, gender roles, and so on, that have become, points of tension in just about every major religious tradition. And they're layered on top of, and here too, I think there are similarities, questions about scriptural interpretation that go back often to 19th century debates, where, if you start with a debate over divorce and remarriage, women's ordination, and then you push deeper, you often end up with a debate about like, how are you interpreting the New Testament? Like, how are you, how are you interpreting sort of the in the teachings of the church, and so on. So there's sort of a top layer that is sort of culture war, right? And then there's another layer that's sort of like, how much can a church that's supposed to be founded by the Son of God change, and how much can we say the church has been correct in its interpretation of Scripture, and so on. The other thing, though, that's interesting with Catholicism is that the climate change versus abortion debate, right? So in general, the social teaching of Catholicism just doesn't map well onto American political divides. It's clearly more left on some issues, and more right on others. And I think it's unfortunately a sign of sort of Catholic weakness in the current environment that Catholics are so often just sort of, in a sense, captured by their partisan teams, right? So it's like, well, once I decide that climate change is the most important issue, then I'm a Democrat. And then, I don't really mind that the Democratic Party is, sort of militantly pro-choice. Or once I've decided abortion is the most important issue, then I don't, I sort of make excuses for the Republican Party's position on certain economic issues. And that, I think, a stronger American Catholicism might actually reduce polarization in the US and sort of should be able to create more of a sort of center. But right now, partisan identity and political identity are just more important to many, many Americans than religious identity. And I think that affects how Catholics think about politics, and not only Catholics, obviously.
Wow, I'm feeling such a sense of kind of a fullness in this conversation, and an overflowing of the questions and energy in the chat, which leaves me a sense of loss that we're coming to the end of our time. There was a really fun question about Bill Buckley, which I'm actually going to ask you both to close on, just in terms of his ongoing spirit. I wanted to just share two quick vignettes from the Jewish tradition and to put these kind of in dialogue to broaden our perspective here, and then kind of pause for station identification. Then Carlene and Ross give you the last word. The two vignettes are, one, it is the case that it's almost a case study in federalism to look at American Judaism, right? There's no kind of center, or it's minimally kind of strong. It's the opposite in that sense of Catholicism. But that wasn't inevitable. There was an attempt. It was a colossal failure in, I think it was around 1904, to have a chief rabbi of New York. In the spirit of the old way, the Ottoman Empire, other places. And you could write an alternate history. I don't think everyone's ever tried to write the counterfactual history of had that succeeded, where we would be as a community. But it's an interesting thing to think that it's, one of these features, that it's so easy for Jews to, literally just walk across the street and go to another denomination, but then to have, marriages and conversions that aren't recognized by other Jews, and set up a synagogue with a different liturgy is, might not have turned out that way. Even though it's so deeply ingrained now, a century plus later, in how we think about what it means to be Jewish in this country. And there have been some fascinating questions about modernity and the conflict between modernity and religion. And here, actually, a broadly international perspective on Judaism is really helpful, because the experience in Christian Europe, early 19th centuries of modernity is this kind of cataclysm, which threatens and ultimately kind of largely empties out the self-contained Jewish kahila, the self-governing community. It's the rise of reform and individualism. But that cataclysmic arrival of modernity never happened in Muslim countries in the same way. And so you actually have a tradition of jurisprudence and of theology that doesn't operate in the same dichotomies of modernity and tradition. In the thought of rabbis and thinkers from North Africa, Iran and Iraq, Yemen, etc., and has proved very fertile in Israel nowadays. That there's, it's common in a Israeli family to have, some of the men are wearing black hats at a Friday night dinner, and others are wearing sequin shirts and perfumed and about to go clubbing as soon as the formalities of the dinner are over on Friday night. And that, Ross, just like you're describing, the ability for religion to hold a center across these tremendous diversities actually is there if we brought into a global view of Judaism, which you don't often take in the American Jewish community, but the ways that in these conversations you kind of painted Catholicism is drawing much more into the fore for me. So I want to say a round of thank yous. First, to everyone who's on this call. I think one of the things that really unites Slifka Center internally and St. Thomas More and draws us into such deep fellowship is the way that community is at the center of our kind of religious lives and intuitions. And tonight, to actually be able to come together in a real measure of online community, thanks to you all showing up and really showing up in the chat window and this conversation has been a source of inspiration despite all the different kinds of distance that are separating us. And then I also want to thank you for you doubted your ability for concision at the beginning, but this was really just a kind of chock full. The recording is going to be listened to and watched many times because there's so much for us to take in here. And Carlene, also for sharing your perspectives, you always do. Father Ryan and Joe, the executive director at St. Thomas More, the whole community there, my colleagues Uri and Jen and Manuel and Lynn who are on the call. It's just a tremendous team to work with. I want to thank everyone and invite you to our next salon. We just booked it today. It's 5 weeks from tonight, February 17th. It will be with Adam Lehman, who's the CEO of Hillel International. The working title is The Jewish Future is Now on College Campuses, Lessons from Hillel for Judaism 5, 20, and 50 years from now. So that's going to be like a really, really fascinating conversation. And I want to ask you both about Buckley, just because he's such a great Yale Catholic figure, to think about his legacy, a certain kind of conservatism, which in some ways is very influential, some ways might be dead, and to hear how both of you kind of interact with his legacy. And I imagine it's, as writings and also as a person who is still larger than life on this campus.
I'll just start by saying we have quite a few students who are, Buckley Fellows. They're very interested in his work, in his legacy and his writings. They go to DC quite often. And so they're I think because I work so closely with the students, I definitely see his legacy as impacting their Yale experience, and sort of almost like shepherding them towards a certain group, a certain community, a certain group of friends, certain, political leanings. They've also had some pretty amazing experiences as being part of the Buckley program here. So I think, that would be my comment, just how his legacy continues to directly impact our students at St. Thomas More.
Oh, Ross, you get the last word.
Well, so I mean, we could do an hour on Buckley. I'll say three things. One is that, I mentioned earlier that we're in this sort of, novel circumstance where more conservative Catholics in the US have ended up being sometimes more skeptical of Pope Francis and the Vatican than any of we, I guess I should say, expected under John Paul II or Benedict XVI. But of course, Buckley began his career as a conservative who was critical of the Vatican, publishing editorials that were critical of Vatican social teaching from the right and so on, which I guess sort of goes to show you that, everything that seems new and novel in inter-Catholic debates actually has precedence. It doesn't even have to be in the 14th century. It can be in the 20th century too. That's one point. A second point about Buckley is that Buckley's career is a testament to the ability of a sort of highbrow, sometimes even dare one say snobbish intellectual to be deeply engaged in national politics and to form successful relationships with politicians who are sort of more populist figures, starting with Barry Goldwater and then going down to Ronald Reagan. And of course, at the time, lots of people, didn't like Ronald Reagan and so on. But I think that, many people are now nostalgic for that mode of republicanism. And I think in those relationships, you saw something that has fallen apart in conservatism in the present era, which is an ability to have a kind of highbrow intellectual side coexisting and, enriching and also restraining the populist side. And we don't have that now. And it's right now kind of hard to imagine that we'll get it back, but it is something to be at least somewhat nostalgic for. And then finally, I didn't know Buckley well, but I did intern at National Review, and I got to, have dinner at his New York apartment and go sailing once on his yacht And, you know, Buckley is he is, you know, there are people in Catholic history who are, you know, worldly figures who are nonetheless, you know, sort of devoted to their faith in a particular way, that is sort of admirable and distinctive. And Buckley, you know, like the late Christopher Hitchens, like a bunch of other figures, belongs to a world of, you know, journalism and celebrity all mixed together that doesn't really exist anymore. And it's very impressive in hindsight that he was able to integrate that kind of larger than life persona and whirlwind world with a deep and serious Catholic faith. And it's something that all of us who fall short of sort of perfect Therese of Lisieux level asceticism can, you know, hold out hope that at least we can achieve that, a certain measure of sincere faith mixed in with our worldliness. So I'll stop there. But I just want to say again, thank you, everyone. This was really terrific, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat about something other than the collapse of the American Republic.
I will say it's something that, you know, I've said this before in Slifka context. It was a remarkable moment when President Salovey, in his first email during the pandemic, said, you know, we're closing down Yale. But you know, Yale's closed down before. It closed for almost 2 years during the American Revolution. And being part of this tradition that the American Revolution's a blip, et cetera, is a source of strength. And you know, if that's true for Yale, as we say in the Right, how much more so for Catholicism and Judaism, and to have the opportunity to remember that there are things that are vital, there are things that are exciting, that there are people who came long before us who actually can provide us with inspiration on a night like tonight, and really the opportunity to connect is grateful, is something we're grateful for, in the, you know, being able to kind of live out their traditions in that chain. Something I feel like we've done really well together. Thank you for inspiring and gathering us tonight, and I hope you all are well and safe, and that we can continue in happier times these conversations and debates. And again, always happy to hear from you. And Ross, thank you for joining this community and convening at this event. Be well, everybody.